So first of all, what is language? Well, if you ask a linguist, they can tell you first what language is not. So language is not the same as speech, despite Tom Wolfe's whole book about it, The Kingdom of Speech. I think it was his last book before he died. And a lot of people see language that way. Yeah, language is what's coming out of your mouth. And of course, you can externalize language in all kinds of ways. You can also use sign language, for instance, or you can write it down. Or most of the time, you don't externalize it at all. So you and I, we are all using language very much at this very moment in our minds. We're creating structures in our minds, and we're not externalizing them at all. So that would be the wrong avenue to go into. What about the idea that language is the same as communication? So if I ask my students every year, what is language? Can you define language? Well, it's a form of communication. And of course it can be used for communication, but most of the time I think it isn't, as I just indicated. So most of the time we think language is used internally to structure your thoughts, more or less. And you don't need to be involved in communication, and that would be language, but you can use it for other means. And of course you can communicate in all kinds of other means. And other animals also communicate. All animals communicate. And you wouldn't necessarily assume that all animals have language. Also plants communicate. And again, you wouldn't necessarily assume that plants have sort of a language. So these are sort of odd definitions, I think, and somewhat misleading. So what is language then? In our view, well, a quote from a paper, human language is grounded on a particular computational mechanism. So it's happening in your mind. It's, of course, realized neurally, so you can study the neural mechanisms, that yields an infinite array of structured expressions. So you can use that mechanism in your mind to create an infinite array of expressions. So it's an incredibly creative force in your mind, you might say. Each expression is assigned an interpretation of two interfaces. So there's this sort of somewhat abstract structure building going on in your mind. And you can do two things with it. On the one hand, so the sort of blue box at the top would be the sort of system for generating these expressions, these hierarchical structures. And on the one hand, these structures can be interpreted by some other system. Linguists would call it the conceptual intentional interface. So basically the system of thought, roughly speaking, that sort of interprets those structures in your mind. So what does it actually mean? And more about that in a moment. On the other hand, you can, if you want to, externalize language. So you can speak, or you can write it down, or you can use sign language. You don't have to, but you can. And also you can receive language. So you can listen to someone else, or you can watch someone else using sign language, or you can read a book. And so you can, this is sort of the connection with the outside world, as it were. So you can, there are special systems for that. And so these are the two interfaces, basically. So this is roughly how linguists, or at least a lot of linguists, think about language. And I talked about structure building. So what kind of structures are being built in your mind at this very moment? Hierarchical structures. So it's in a recent paper we titled it Structures, Not Strings. So we're talking about structures in your mind, not just strings of words that come out of your mouth. But what's happening in your mind is much more complicated, namely the formation of hierarchical structures. And just for a non-linguist like me, a reminder of how that works. Well, for instance, this is an example from a book that I edited, and I realized I should update it. So I assume that this is a vegetarian butcher. The brother of the butcher looks at himself, and what does himself refer to? Well, of course, logically you would think, well, it refers to the closest noun, so the butcher. But every child knows that himself refers to the brother of the butcher. So it's a bit of an odd thing that it doesn't seem the logical way of saying it, of having the connections. And the clue is that you have to look at the hierarchical structure in the mind, and then it turns out that the noun phrase, the brother of the butcher, is the highest in the hierarchy compared to the noun phrase, the butcher. So apparently himself refers to the highest noun phrase in the hierarchy. That's apparently how it works in our mind. So keep that in mind.